It happened in less than 4 minutes, but the shockwave would last for weeks. The university auditorium had been filled with standing ovations, patriotic music, and the familiar scent of polished wood and old books. It was the annual Veterans Legacy Award ceremony. A night meant to honor those who had served, not to make headlines. But everything changed when Senator Elizabeth Warren took the stage. Dressed in a deep navy blazer and heels that echoed across the mahogany floor, she paused for dramatic effect before leaning into the microphone. "My grandfather fought for this country," she began, her voice steady but swelling with what seemed like sincerity. "His courage runs in my blood, and tonight I honor him by standing for every forgotten soldier." The audience clapped politely. Then she added something else, something no one saw coming. "Unlike some who wear the flag only when the cameras are on," she said with a pointed smile, "my loyalty was inherited, not purchased." The crowd shifted. Some chuckled. Others looked confused. But one man in the front row didn't move a muscle. Senator John Kennedy. His hands were folded, eyes locked on her, expression unreadable. What the cameras didn't show at first was the moment a decorated war widow stood up quietly in the back row and walked out, holding her husband's folded flag to her chest. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating. That single gesture said more than any speech ever could. And yet Warren kept speaking, bringing up dates, battles, family stories. She was building something, an image, a legacy, a shield. But what no one in that room knew yet was that it was about to collapse, because Kennedy had come prepared. Not with a rebuttal, not with an insult, but with something much colder, a truth no applause could drown out. In the hours before the ceremony, Kennedy had received a tip. A retired Army records clerk had contacted his office with documents that didn't match Warren's public claims. He didn't act immediately. He waited. He watched. And when she made her story the center of the evening, he knew the moment had come. But he didn't storm the stage. He didn't call a press conference. He simply waited for her to finish, folded a piece of paper in half, and wrote a question. Just one. Later, people would say it was the most cinematic moment ever caught on a C-SPAN live stream. But in real time, no one knew what was about to unfold. After Warren concluded with, "I know where I come from, and that story will never be taken from me." The crowd gave her a standing ovation. It felt rehearsed. It felt like theater. And Kennedy, still seated, simply exhaled. A student behind him caught a glimpse of the paper in his hand. An old service record stamped with a date that would contradict everything Warren had just said. But instead of waving it around, Kennedy tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He stood, smoothed his tie, and made his way to the podium just as the MC was preparing to close the evening. "May I have a moment?" he asked gently. The room quieted, more curious than concerned. Then, in a voice that could cut through marble, he said, "Before we leave tonight, I just want to ask one question. Not to shame, not to fight, just to understand. At this moment, you might think you know where this story is headed. But I promise you, you don't. Because what Kennedy said next didn't just change the mood, it flipped the entire narrative. And if you've ever heard someone twist the truth so tightly it becomes armor, you'll want to hear what happens next. But before we go further, if this kind of quiet confrontation and emotional reckoning hits you like it hit that room, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're the kind of person who values truth over applause, drop a 9 in the comments so we know you're still watching. Trust me, you haven't heard the question yet, and when you do, it's going to stay with you. The silence that followed Kennedy's words wasn't just silence. It was the kind that clung to the air, that made every throat in the room tighten and every pair of eyes suddenly lock in his direction. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move fast. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a worn envelope, the kind that looked like it had been folded and refolded 100 times. He placed it gently on the podium, tapped it twice with his fingers, and then looked up, not at the crowd, but directly at Senator Warren, who was still seated in the front row, lips pressed into a careful smile. "This," he said quietly, "is a copy of the official military records for a Mr. George H. Reed, born June 4th, 1910, Oklahoma, also known, in some interviews and in tonight's speech, as your grandfather." The name hovered in the air like a thread pulled loose from a tightly sewn lie. Warren's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Kennedy continued. "According to the National Archives, Mr. Reed never served in the armed forces, not in World War I, not in World War II, not in any branch of military service. In 1942, during the height of the war, he was working as a railway inspector in Tulsa." He paused, letting the words land. "That doesn't make him less of a man, but it does make the story less of a fact." A single cough broke the silence somewhere in the back. Cameras had started rolling again. Someone in the audience was quietly live-streaming on Instagram. And just like that, the tone of the evening shifted. What had begun as celebration now felt like a trial. And Kennedy wasn't the prosecutor. He was the witness. "I'm not here to take away anyone's memories," he said, softer now. "But when a story is offered as a badge of moral superiority, when it's used to elevate one voice over the silence of real sacrifice, I believe that story deserves scrutiny." Warren finally stood, her body stiff, jaw clenched. "With all due respect, Senator," she began, "you're taking an old family story and weaponizing it. My grandmother told me those things. I believed them." Kennedy didn't flinch. "I'm not questioning what you believed," he said calmly. "I'm questioning what you decided to repeat, on this stage, in front of real veterans, with medals on their chests and ghosts in their hearts." The audience didn't gasp. They didn't cheer. But something deeper happened. Heads turned, expressions changed, and a new weight fell over the room. Then, from the second row, a man in uniform stood up slowly. His name tag read, Corporal D. Estrada. He looked no older than 30, but his eyes carried wars most people read about in newspapers. Without saying a word, he removed the medal from his chest, walked toward the stage, and placed it on the edge of the podium in front of Kennedy. Then he turned to Warren, looked her directly in the eyes, and said, "My father died in Fallujah. I don't get to speak for him. Neither do you." The room erupted, not in applause, but in truth. A hum of voices, shifting seats, a few people leaving quietly, reporters scrambling to reframe their headlines. Warren stood frozen, her speech folder still in her hands, unopened now, unreadable. Kennedy looked down at the medal, then gently covered it with the envelope. "This doesn't need a debate," he said softly. It needed a pause. By the time he stepped back, the live stream had hit 400,000 views. TikTok was already flooded with the clip, stitched and recaptioned in real time. Hashtags like Tontour Truth, Over Legacy, and Kennedy Question were starting to trend. Backstage, Warren's aide whispered urgently into her ear, but she waved him off. Her face was pale. Her voice never came back. Outside the auditorium, the night air felt colder than expected. Students and veterans gathered in clusters, replaying the moment on their phones. One whispered, "He didn't even accuse her. He just showed her the mirror." Another replied, "And she blinked." The story was no longer about politics or ancestry or even military records. It had become something else, something harder to dismiss. It had become a question about who gets to speak for sacrifice and who just borrows its light. And that question was now out in the open, echoing far beyond the walls of that grand old hall. By the next morning, The clip had already racked up over 2 million views across multiple platforms, but inside the university halls, it was the silence that still echoed. Students passed one another in the corridors with hushed glances, as if they had all witnessed something sacred the night before, something too raw to fully speak about, yet too profound to ignore. The student veteran group canceled their planned discussion about federal grants and instead called an open forum titled simply, "When Stories Hurt." Professors, usually quick to move on from controversy, paused their lessons to ask a different kind of question. What makes a story true? Not in facts alone, but in intent. But none of that compared to what happened next. That afternoon, the university invited both Senator Warren and Senator Kennedy to participate in a follow-up panel called Reflections on Service and Truth, which was meant to smooth things over, to show unity, to move forward. Warren declined. Kennedy accepted with one condition. No moderator, just stories and questions. The auditorium was packed again, standing room only. A different energy filled the space this time. Less celebratory, more surgical. Kennedy stepped to the stage alone, holding a small notepad and the same envelope from the night before. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't even bring aides. Just a gray sweater, slacks, and a face that carried more gravity than charisma. "I was told this was a space for reflection," he began, "so let's reflect." The audience leaned in. "Last night, I asked a question I believe too many people in this country are afraid to ask. Not, is your story true? But, why are you telling it?" He paused. "There's a difference between honoring the people who came before you and using them to stand taller than others." Then he shared a story no one expected. "When I was 13, he said, I watched my uncle come back from Vietnam. He didn't speak for 6 weeks. He didn't smile for 6 months. He never told war stories, not because he had none, but because they belonged to the people who didn't come home. He told me once, 'If you ever speak for me, make sure I'm listening.' The room was still. No blinking, no coughing, just breath held tight. And that, Kennedy said, is why I spoke yesterday. Not to shame anyone, not to score points, but because stories, once told in public, stop being private shields. They become public weapons if we're not careful, especially when wrapped in applause." A student stood up, Emily Reyes, a political science major, and asked, "But Senator, don't you think people are allowed to share their backgrounds, even if the details aren't perfect?" Kennedy didn't hesitate. "Yes, but not when those details create moral leverage. You don't get to use an embellished past to silence someone else's present pain." Someone clapped in the back. Then more joined in. Not loud, just enough. He continued, "What we saw last night wasn't a takedown. It was a reveal. Not of one person's dishonesty, but of a culture that rewards performance over authenticity, where saying the right thing matters more than living it." He looked toward the empty seat marked "Reserved for Senator Warren." "This chair isn't empty because someone lied. It's empty because someone refused to answer the question that followed. If your story was meant to inspire, why did it feel rehearsed?" The audience sat with that. Deeply. Then Kennedy pulled something from his notepad. A handwritten letter. "This," he said, "was given to me this morning by a sophomore named Luis Carter. His father served in Afghanistan. Luis wrote, 'I used to think that public service meant telling your story well, but now I think it means listening harder than you speak.'" Kennedy folded the letter, placed it into the envelope, and left it on the same podium. "That's the kind of story we should honor," he said. "One that humbles, not one that elevates the speaker." He stepped back from the mic, nodded once to the crowd, and walked off stage, not waiting for applause, not checking his phone, not glancing back. That afternoon, CNN ran the headline, "Kennedy reframes heroism, stories that serve, not shine." Meanwhile, a quiet wave began moving across college campuses, churches, veterans groups, even TikTok pages. The phrase, "stories that serve," started trending. Some students began adding it to their email signatures. Others wrote it on whiteboards or stuck Post-it notes with the question, "Who does your story serve?" Because somewhere in the midst of all the noise, a new kind of clarity had taken root. One that didn't shout or shame, but that simply asked with haunting grace, "Why are you telling the story you tell? And are you willing to stand in the silence that follows your answer?" The storm didn't hit all at once. It moved like a tide, slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. By the evening of the second day, the clip of Senator Kennedy placing the folded envelope atop the podium had been viewed over 10 million times. It had crossed platforms, age groups, and even political lines, not because it was aggressive, but because it was undeniable. Elizabeth Warren, once praised for her eloquence and resilience, now found herself in the crosshairs, not of outrage, but of quiet disbelief. And that kind of disappointment was far harder to shake. Her office released a 3-sentence statement just before midnight. Senator Warren stands by her tribute to her grandfather, whose spirit and sacrifice shaped her values. She believes in honoring all forms of service. She will not be responding further. But by morning, it was already too late. Journalists began digging, and what they found wasn't scandal. It was strategy. Copies of past speeches, transcripts, even ghost-written memoir drafts all carried the same anecdote about Grandfather Reed's service. The language had been repeated nearly word for word across different platforms over a decade. What once sounded personal now felt packaged, and the public could tell. Then came the next crack in the story. A retired archivist who had worked on a university project cataloging oral histories posted a video. Calm, neutral, no political lean. He said, "I interviewed Ms. Warren's family years ago. The story of military service wasn't mentioned, not once." That video went viral in less than 2 hours. It wasn't the facts that hurt Warren most. It was the realization that her truth had been quietly shifting, evolving to fit the rooms she entered. And now, for the first time, someone had walked in with the receipts, and the room didn't belong to her anymore. But the moment that truly shattered the illusion came later that night, during a national awards ceremony for Gold Star families. Warren had been scheduled as a guest speaker, months in advance, well before the incident. The organizers were torn, unsure whether to pull her or let her speak and face the fallout. Ultimately, they left it up to the families themselves. In a private vote, 82% requested the program be adjusted. Her name was removed. No statement. No drama. Just a quiet replacement. Corporal D. Estrada, the same young man who had placed his medal on Kennedy's podium. His speech was simple, honest. He spoke not of politics or history, but of losing his father, of learning to fold a flag at age 9, of the silence that lived in his home every Memorial Day. He ended with one line. "When you borrow someone else's pain, make sure they handed it to you." The room stood, not out of ceremony, but because the truth had finally spoken for itself. Meanwhile, Kennedy stayed silent. He hadn't tweeted. He hadn't commented. He didn't gloat or follow up. Instead, he returned to his routine. Committee hearings, town halls, reading letters from constituents. When asked by a reporter if he had anything to say about the fallout, he replied, "Not everything needs a sequel." But his impact kept spreading. At universities, professors used the story in classes on ethics, communication, and leadership, not as a scandal, but as a case study. The Kennedy question, "Who does your story serve?" had become more than viral. It had become instructional. It wasn't about exposing a lie. It was about tracing the purpose behind a narrative. And in that space, something powerful had taken hold. Students began creating discussion groups around storytelling and self-representation. Veterans organizations launched campaigns asking public figures to verify claims before speaking on behalf of those who had served. A well-known podcast series opened their latest episode with a cold open from Kennedy's question, followed by an hour-long panel titled, "When Memory Meets Morality." But it was a short clip from a high school classroom in Ohio that truly captured what the moment had become. A teacher wrote on the board, "Roots or leverage," and asked his students to journal their own family stories, but with a challenge. Would this story stand on its own if you never got credit for it? The assignment went viral, not because it was political, but because it was human. Back in Washington, Warren kept her schedule minimal. She stopped taking interviews. She canceled a book tour quietly. And though she remained in office, something had changed. Not her seat, her voice. What once carried certainty now felt calculated. Even supporters admitted the moment had hurt. Not because it destroyed her, but because it revealed something they weren't ready to see. In the end, the story hadn't been about stolen valor or even personal exaggeration. It had been about something far more familiar, the temptation to elevate ourselves by borrowing struggle, and the quiet courage it takes to resist that temptation. Kennedy had never accused. He had asked, and in doing so he had given everyone in the country, on both sides of every aisle, a question they couldn't stop hearing. Who does your story serve? By the fifth day, it was no longer just a conversation. It had become a cultural shift. The headlines had moved on, but the question hadn't. It was still out there, drifting through dinner tables, echoing in classrooms, and surfacing in spaces where performance had long replaced authenticity. What began as one senator's calm inquiry had turned into a quiet revolution in how people thought about storytelling, reputation, and credibility. And while Elizabeth Warren remained mostly silent, the world around her kept talking. The silence didn't protect her. It amplified the absence of a real answer. Meanwhile, Senator John Kennedy continued on like nothing had happened. He hadn't posted a victory statement, hadn't done a single interview beyond his regular schedule. In fact, the only public response he gave was a brief comment at a high school civics Q&A in Baton Rouge. A student stood and asked nervously, "Senator Kennedy, did you mean to end Elizabeth Warren's career with that question?" Kennedy smiled softly, leaned into the microphone and said, "I didn't end anything. I just held up a mirror. It's not my fault what someone sees in it." The room exhaled all at once, as if finally allowed to breathe again. But while Kennedy moved forward, Warren couldn't escape the shadow now following her. It wasn't just her legacy being questioned. It was her intent. And in this new atmosphere, intent mattered more than ever. The following weekend, a well-known Ivy League debate tournament featured a surprise final round prompt. Is identity a platform or a possession? Nearly every team quoted Kennedy. Some built entire arguments around his phrasing. Others deconstructed it, acknowledging how one question, when asked with precision and humility, could cut deeper than 1,000 accusations. A 17-year-old finalist from Georgia stood at the podium and said, "This is what truth sounds like when it doesn't need to shout." The crowd applauded, not just because she was right, but because everyone felt it too. That same night, a group of veterans published an open letter in the New York Times. It wasn't political. It didn't mention any names. It simply read, "We ask that when you speak our names, our stories, or our pain, you do so with weight, not as a stepping stone, but as a moment of stillness. Our sacrifices aren't currency for your credibility." The letter was signed by over 14,000 veterans across the country within 72 hours. And still, Senator Warren said nothing. Her next public appearance was meant to be a moderated panel on public service and ethics at a renowned West Coast university. But when she walked into the hall, something was different. The smiles were thinner. The applause was polite, not passionate. When the floor opened for questions, a student stood and asked, "Senator, do you believe stories lose value when they gain political utility?" For the first time in her career, Warren hesitated. She looked down, adjusted her notes, and answered, "I believe stories can evolve." The room fell into a soft, uneasy quiet. Backstage, her aide whispered, "That didn't land." She nodded, slowly folding the papers in front of her. There was nothing else to say. Elsewhere, something unexpected was happening. The phrase, "Who does your story serve?" began appearing on merchandise, not in a commercial sense, but as a movement. Stickers, notebooks, classroom posters, even digital wallpapers shared among students, soldiers, and entrepreneurs, not for profit, for perspective. TEDx speakers started referencing it. CEOs began quoting it in boardrooms, and at a nonprofit leadership summit in Denver, a speaker closed with it, then paused, and asked the room to sit in silence for 30 seconds before clapping. That 30 seconds felt longer than most speeches. It was the kind of silence that said, "This is more than a moment." Kennedy, when asked again by a journalist whether he planned to revisit the conversation, responded with just one line. "I think the question did its job." But the truth was, it was still working. Because the ripple effect of one envelope, one voice, one question had created a different kind of accountability. One that couldn't be voted away, canceled, or spun. It demanded more than facts. It asked for reflection. And that was far harder to dodge. Back on the Senate floor a week later, as bills were being debated and procedural motions filled the chamber, Warren passed by Kennedy's desk. She paused for a second. He looked up. Their eyes met. There was no animosity, no smile, just a quiet moment. Two people who now understood that one sentence had changed them both. She gave the faintest nod and walked on. Some stories are never answered. Some questions are never forgotten. And this one was still ringing. Weeks had passed, but the question never left. It traveled silently, like a breeze that slipped beneath the surface of public conversation. Not loud, not viral anymore, but present in job interviews, college essays, church sermons, and boardroom meetings. "Who does your story serve?" had become more than a quote. It had become a filter through which people began examining not just others, but themselves. Senator Kennedy didn't mention it again, not on the record. He returned to his committee work, responded to letters from Louisiana farmers, and held town halls in rural counties where broadband issues mattered more than Senate drama. Yet everywhere he went, people brought it up. Not with fire in their voices, but with respect. "You made us think, Senator," one grandmother told him at a diner in Lafayette. "That's a rare kind of noise." Kennedy only nodded and replied, "Thinking's underrated these days." Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren resumed her public duties with a cautious poise. She introduced policy proposals, participated in hearings, and gave a few speeches, though none of them touched identity. None of them told stories. The folders she once held so proudly with personal anecdotes and family lineage were now replaced with spreadsheets and statistics. She didn't retreat. She recalibrated. But everyone could feel it. The personal power in her words had been pulled out like a thread, and though the fabric still held, it no longer draped the same. What truly cemented the shift wasn't politics, though. It was a classroom. At an inner-city high school in Milwaukee, a history teacher named Mr. Daniels began every semester with a new tradition. Each student was asked to share a personal story, just one, and then answer a single follow-up question written on the whiteboard in bold blue marker. Would this story still matter if no one knew it was yours? At first, the students didn't get it, but as they listened to each other speak about sacrifice, about survival, about grandparents and betrayals, they began to understand. Truth wasn't only in the telling. It was in the why. One student, a quiet girl named Mariah, spoke about her father being deported when she was 9. She told it without tears, without drama, just facts, moments, pauses. When asked why she shared it, she looked at the board and said, "Because I think the story matters more than how people look at me afterward." The room didn't clap. It just sat in stillness. And that stillness said everything. The story made its way to a local news piece, which caught the attention of NPR, then TED. Before long, Kennedy's quiet question had become a topic in national educational discussions, framed not as a political moment, but as a cultural reckoning. A reframing of identity, legacy, and integrity. And then, something even more surprising happened. A best-selling memoir about resilience, one that had been optioned for a major streaming series, was voluntarily pulled by the author. In a statement, she wrote, "I built my story on moments that inspired me, but I'm not sure I ever asked whether I had the right to use them. The Kennedy moment made me realize I owe that question to the people who lived those moments, not just to myself." She returned her advance. The book was shelved. The conversation deepened. For once, the public wasn't canceling. They were reflecting. And that may have been the most powerful shift of all. This wasn't about punishing someone who stretched the truth. It wasn't about exposing a fraud. It was about how easily people borrow pain, how naturally they build a brand from it, and how rarely they ask who that brand actually helps. Kennedy didn't need to fight. He didn't even need to prove. He just needed to ask, and then let the silence do what accusations never could. One afternoon, as Kennedy exited a side door after a closed-door education committee meeting, a young staffer stopped him in the hallway. "Senator, if you don't mind me asking, how did you come up with that question?" Kennedy smiled, tapped the notepad in his jacket pocket, and said, "Didn't come up with it. I just finally asked what everyone else had been avoiding." And then he walked away. Outside, a freshman journalist waited with a recorder in hand, hoping for one last soundbite. Kennedy paused, gave her a look of kindness mixed with steel, and simply said, "Some stories build bridges. Others build pedestals. You better know which one you're standing on." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. Because that story, his story, wasn't about him anymore. It was already working.